Welcome back, everybody. You're tuned into the RPG Radio, and on this week's episode, we've got a brand new build series kicking off for something I can only describe as pure, unadulterated, catastrophic doom. This build will be focused on chaos damage, fire damage, and vitality damage, while funneling all of those into our signature ability, Doombolt. This is part 1 of this build guide and will be taking you from levels 1 to 30 with the necessary abilities, classes, and the beginnings of the devotion tree. We've even got some early components to smooth out the damage curve and make sure we're slapping to maximum doom ability. If you don't love chaos, red lightning, and nearly constant doom puns, then go check out any of the other builds on this channel. There are plenty to choose from. Enough foreplay though, let's peel back the curtain and start the show. As you may have guessed, this build is focused on one ability to do the brunt of the damage. The ability, however, is locked behind quite a few levels and getting the mastery bar pushed up almost to the max. The ability in question is, of course, the Doombolt. Doombolt is an occultist ability, and that's going to deal chaos damage, vitality damage, and will increase the crit damage that you can do with this button. The idea is that once we hit ultimate, we're going to use a single button to do so much damage along with so much offensive ability, most of the enemies should just be a pile of glowing red dust before they can even get close. This is a bit of a caveat though. Because we're only level 30, you'll have to make some decisions as a player on how you want those first 30 levels to go. Realistically, you can put points into other abilities to help smooth out the leveling process to get to Doombolt. If you want to brute force your way there though without leveling much of anything else, you can typically unlock the ability around level 18 or 19. I decided to give myself a small healer in the form of my little birdly familiar, but that only set me back about 3 points, which is just one level at the end of all things. Generally, what I'm saying here is that you decide if you want to start working on those backup Doom Dancers first, or if you want to tough it out with the component abilities all the way up to level 18-ish. If you're not a masochist for the Doombolt like yours truly, then there are a number of other abilities that we can start grabbing some early points in to make the leveling experience a little less doom and quite a bit more zoom. The first of these abilities that you'll have access to is the one I mentioned just a second ago called Summoned Familiar. The Familiar is a little bird buddy who can attack, heal, and summon lightning bolts that our Vindicator build from the last video would be so proud of. The Great Raven can only be summoned one at a time and can be pretty easily killed if it gets stuck in a big damage puddle or surrounded by a ton of enemies. That's not a huge concern given that when you're in melee, the monsters aren't usually interested in your summons when they've got a big juicy main character to attack instead. So while your familiar is safe, it will attack enemies from range, dealing a small percentage of your weapon damage with some lightning and electrocute damage added right on top of there. I only took 1 point early since I'm not really after the little guy for his damage output, at least not right away. Once we get the mastery bar up to his second tier, we're going to unlock Mend Flesh. This is the Raven's AoE heal ability and gives you both a percent and flat health heal. Now this early in the game, the percent health isn't going to be as useful as the flat health that you get back with this heal, but since it can happen pretty often, we're not really worried about the amounts as much. At this point, we're pretty much done with our bird buddy because there's a couple other abilities that we can add a point to while we fill the mastery bar up to his next important skill. Your first passive in this build is rather doom-centric because it's going to add constant, easy chaos damage to everything that we do. After that, we're looking at attack speed and vitality damage buffs as well, and that is all wrapped up in the nice little present that is Soleil's Witchfire. Soleil's Witchfire is an always active buff with some really impressive modifiers later down the line. We only need a point or two at this stage and can start investing harder in the second leg of our build journey. When you're sub 50 though, the early chaos damage that this passive adds to your kit is pretty handy. At the particular moment of this video, our Deceiver is sitting right around 1000 chaos damage and buffing that by almost 500%. Through some shrewd use of components like the Rift Stone and a couple Roiling Bloods, we can get the early damage for this build up pretty significantly. Now that's ultimately a tangent that is doomed to derail the original point, but just remember that Witchfire is good for a point or two and will pay off way harder the more that we level it up. The two modifiers for this ability are pretty important too, and you may actually end up maxing out the first one because it's a really small amount required for a really big payoff, at least what I consider a big payoff. Consecrated Blade is available shortly after you get Witchfire, and for just 3 points, you're going to convert 30% of your physical damage into chaos damage. And the reason that that is important, specifically when you are pre-level 50, a lot of weapons you'll pick up are going to be mostly physical in the damage that they do, at least the ones that deal the most damage in my experience. In fact, it may take quite a while to get yourself a solid main hand weapon with chaos damage, given that you don't see too many chaos enemies before Act 3. Now you can go dungeon diving in the East Marsh and the secret dungeon, but I'll leave it up to you to decide if that's worth your time for finding a weapon early on. What's more likely to happen is that you'll find a downright doomed amount of physical damage on something like a two-handed axe or a hammer, and you won't want to change that bad boy for a ridiculous amount of time. For example, I found myself a really nice two-handed axe at about level 22, and it wasn't even particularly good. It didn't have the stats I wanted, didn't give me any points into any of the abilities that we were using, and didn't even take out the garbage that I asked it to last week. The problem was that the damage was so high that nothing else I was finding even came close, no matter how nice the other stats were. I actually didn't find another weapon to replace this until about level 38 at the start of Act 3. The good news is that it was a monster infrequent, and Voldrak the Troll will drop it every time, so it's pretty nice little damage bump and some points into one of our passives no matter what. As long as you're making it to that point in the story, you can pick it up too. That whole tangent is basically there to tell you that Consecrated Blade is taking a lot of that physical damage and making it work for chaos. You'll also want to try and grab a Rift Stone if you can, because that component adds some flat chaos damage to your weapon as well. The Emperor would be incredibly disappointed in us, and we'd probably be writhing in holy fire at this point, but you gotta do what you gotta do for the Doom. After Consecrated Blade, we're going to turn our attention to the next modifier on the list, which is called Second Right. Now, this modifier isn't going to be the most useful thing in the world, even early on. In Ultimate, it's going to be doing tons for us in the Vitality damage department, but for now, the Chaos damage buffs and Vitality damage increase aren't the most flashy things we've ever seen. It's a solid runner-up though, since the other 2/3 of the ability is really pulling most of the weight. The Vitality damage will bring up the rear since our backup dancer damage, and it's never a bad thing to have more backup dancers, but the Vitality resistance that we'll end up getting from this modifier later on will pay back all of the effort that we put into it, so it's good to just have a point or two in it, at least for memory's sake. What you might end up doing instead of that first point into Second Right is actually switch down to your little bird buddy again to take the Lightning Strike ability. Really, this is only a single point that you need because, again, the bird isn't going to be a huge focus for this build, but early on, his Lightning Strike is a very big AoE, dealing 70% of your weapon damage, along with Lightning and Electrocute and the ability to stun targets it hits. He actually casts Lightning Strike so often that he can delete entire mobs on his own, at least prior to level 50. It's pretty good, and being that he activates it so often, he can do a lot of the legwork on his own. The only trouble that I really found with the Summon Familiar is that his energy bar runs really low pretty quick, so you'll just have to summon a new one once his energy bar hits that, 5% threshold. Because he's casting Men Flesh and Lightning Strike so often, he runs out of energy pretty quick. There is one other very important activatable ability on the Occultist tree that I do feel needs some attention, and that is our Sigil of Consumption. There are actually a couple builds on this channel that make use of this ability, and I have always felt that it is severely underrated for what it can do. To be perfectly honest though, the early levels with Sigil of Consumption and the devotion that we're going to attach to it make it extremely potent for clearing and getting your health back. That said, Sigil of Consumption has a 3-second skill cooldown, but lasts for 6 seconds. So you're going to place the sigil on the ground. It is going to activate in anywhere from a 3 to 4 meter radius, depending on the amount of points that you put into it. And once you get this maxed out, the radius will continue to increase. So the more points, the bigger it gets, the more damage it does, and that is going to be vitality damage. Of that vitality damage, you are going to get a percentage back in health. So this is not only a sigil of vitality damage, it is a vampiric sigil on top of everything else, hence the consumption part of the name. It's also going to be dealing a vitality decay damage, which is just the damage over time version of vitality damage. The modifier for Sigil of Consumption is Destruction, and ultimately this modifier may make it more important for our purposes than the ability itself. If it weren't for increasing the actual size of the ability, I'd say Destruction is going to be much more important than the base ability. Destruction is ultimately going to do some very simple stuff for us though. It is going to add fire and chaos damage to the vitality damage that Sigil of Consumption is doing. On top of those flat damage additions, it's also going to add a buff to the vitality damage that the base ability is doing. So, all of that together means that Destruction and Sigil of Consumption as a pair will be helping you do lots more consistent damage to enemies in big groups while healing you, activating your devotion coming up, and just helping clear the field while Doombolt is on its cooldown. After all that talk about backup dancers though, we can't forget the real glue holding this chaotic cake together. You might even say this beautiful 3-tiered chaos confectionery would go perfect with a bit of possession sitting right on top. Possession is going to be our one exclusive skill in this build, and it should be a real easy decision, but we'll touch on that part in just a sec. Possession is a Chaos build's best friend and comes with a bunch of stats that we'll love, starting with the best of them all, damage absorption. Now, percent damage absorption specifically starts out strong at 3% and only goes up from there on this passive. At a full 12 levels of possession, you are getting yourself a whopping 18% damage absorption, which is an ungodly amount of damage reduction for any build. It's also a pretty big chunk of chaos damage getting added to our increasing bucket of base chaos, and the bigger the base amount, the better the multiplicative damage increase from all of our buffs. After the nice bonus to our base possession is going to do us another solid and slap a chaos, vitality, and vitality decay damage buff on us as well. We're getting some buffs to acid and poison too, which isn't the worst thing in the world because this build is going to end up having some incidental acid damage too, and it just keeps on giving because that's the kind of ability that possession really is. Lastly, the greatest passive we've ever gotten is going to hit us with two really awesome stats, and the first is sheer chaos resistance. That, my friends, is a commodity that does not come easy for a lot of builds. The second is a bit more of a strange stat that you probably haven't seen much of really anyplace. It's called Skill Disruption Protection, and this ability is going to 100% protect you from one of the most annoying things that enemies can do to you in the entire game. Now, you see there are a couple enemies in the game that will interrupt your abilities and put them on short cooldowns all at once. And some of them can do this in huge puddles of persistent damage that just sits on the ground. And while it's sitting there, it's ticking away on you and it's consistently activating this skill interruption. So possession, when we have this active, is going to take 100% of the uptime on those disruptive abilities and turn it to 0 and say, haha, you guys are stupid for investing in that type of damage. All in all, if you're the type of player who likes to use the Occultist class in a lot of your builds, you probably know how great Possession is anyway, and I don't have to tell you. But this passive is so incredibly useful. It's really just too hard not to sing the praises of it in every opportunity I get. But I'm sure you're all just brimming with anticipation to hear about the second class that we've chosen for this build, at least those of you who didn't catch that little Deceiver part that I mentioned early on. The Deceiver is an Occultist mixed with an Inquisitor, and this build specifically is going to ignore that Inquisitor tree for a very, very, very long time. The Inquisitor tree has a couple abilities that I want to look at, but we're not going to talk about those until the next video because the Inquisitor tree is almost entirely ignored apart from the mastery bar so that we can get as many points as possible into Doombolt and Possession very early. The whole reason that this build is just screaming through a lot of the mobs in the early game is because it is pretty well leveled and the abilities all have lots of points into them, at least the ones that we're trying to make work the hardest. There is, however, one skill that you'll want on the Inquisitor tree as soon as it becomes available, and that is your Deadly Aim. Deadly Aim is going to activate off of any critical attack that you have with a 100% chance of activating, and it is going to increase your damage by 30% at level 3, it is going to increase your crit damage by 6% at level 3, and it is going to give you 8% offensive ability at level 3. That is a single point in and a couple items helping us get there, but ultimately Deadly Aim is going to help your abilities hit that critical mark and deal as much damage as possible, which in the case of Doombolt is exceedingly more because it gives itself the ability to do more crit damage. So the higher the offensive ability, the more likelihood to crit, and for Doombolt specifically, when it does crit, the damage is going to be straight obnoxious. One other thing I'll mention if you made it this far in the video is that you may be seeing a lot of crazy experience gain happening with this build, and that is not because of the build itself. This is probably something you'll see happen in a lot more videos starting from this one, but I did farm the Lokar set quite a while ago, and when you have this entire set equipped, you are getting an additional 40% experience gained from killing enemies and doing all the experience gaining that a regular player does. That, with the Explorer's Pants, which are the only part of the Explorer's set that don't overlap with the Lokar set, are giving us 5% experience gained on top of that. We're also using a belt that is giving us 8% experience gained, and a medal that should be giving us anywhere from 3 to 5% experience gained on top of that. All in all, from levels 1 to 30 to about 40, if we really push the Lokar set as far as I'm thinking, we're looking at about 40%, 50, about 58 to 60% extra experience gained just because of these items. Now, I know that if you are new to Grim Dawn, that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you, and you may want to go farm these right away, but in order to do that, you'll have to get a pretty strong build early on. You'll need to go hunt down Lokar over and over again because there is 4 pieces. You have shoulders, you have helmet, you have chest, and you have boots. You have to get all of those things from Lokar to achieve the entire set, and you can go in and farm him over and over again, but the caveat to that is that Lokar is a secret boss, and he is insanely difficult. He is the easiest of what a lot of people would consider the pinnacle bosses in Grim Dawn, but he does ultimately give you the best way to create new builds, farm them up early, and get a good feel for them in his set. If you need a build specifically, I would recommend going to check out the Spellbinder build that I have on this channel, because that is the first build that I was consistently able to farm him on, with it being relatively easy to stay alive while dealing enough damage and kiting him around. It is a caster build, but it is pretty tanky outside of the ultimate boss content, so if you like just shredding through the normal game and getting that type of stuff done, I would highly recommend going out and farming this build. Or this set, sorry. Build is the Spellbinder on the channel if you want to go check that out, or you can do it on your own. Lokar himself does lots and lots of fire damage and is a massive pain in the tutor, but after you do it enough times, you'll get used to it. Now, there are a few things remaining in this build to talk about, and those are going to be our devotions. We have a couple of them completed this early on in the build, but there's only about 3. That being said, the next video will likely get us much closer to the finished product, but it won't be until build 3, or video 3 of the build, that you'll have the entire devotion map figured out, getting us all the way over to one of the big chaos damage devotions, which is Dying God. To start things off though, you'll want to pick up the Crossroads of Chaos, which is your pink crossroad, and that is going to unlock you the Fiend constellation. Fiend is actually going to be really useful with this build, and it is some really consistent damage when you attach it to your Sigil of Consumption. Now, the devotion itself is going to give you buffs to fire and chaos damage. It's going to give you flat bonus to spirit. It's going to buff some pets as well if you decide to hang on to your summon familiar into the late game. It's probably not a bad thing. You're also getting chaos resistance in 8% fashion, and at the end of all things, you are going to have access to the Flame Torrent ability. Flame Torrent is actually incredibly awesome as itself because it is on a very short cooldown of only 0.5 seconds, and given that Sigil of Consumption is a big AoE ability, having a 25% chance to activate on that huge AoE means that this is almost a constant uptime on your Flame Torrent. The reason that Flame Torrent in and of itself is good with that short cooldown is because it's dealing 20% of your weapon damage with fire, chaos, and burn damage all mixed in there as well. This ability is a melee dream. It is almost a small nuclear device all of its own, but given that it can only activate when you use your Sigil of Consumption, you'll really want to go step into the Sigil and clumps of enemies to get the maximum usage out of Flame Torrent. It only activates in a circle around your character, so it will shoot out fire. That fire will circle around you once, and then it will go away. If the ability is activating consistently, that should be every 0.5 seconds, but there's really no accounting for chance. Just remember, Flame Torrent can be activated pretty consistently, so when you do run into enemies in big clumps, they can still get absolutely doomed by the roasting effects of the Flame Torrent. The next devotion you'll want to pick up is the Wretch, and Wretch unfortunately does not have an active ability like the Fiend does, but it is still providing some decent stats and the affinity that is going to get us ever closer to the Dying God. Wretch will be giving you acid and chaos damage buffs right off the top. It's giving you a big chunk of bleeding resistance though in the 12% department. You're getting 15 physique, 15 defensive ability, and 140 health, so lots of big stats going into this. It's also giving you acid retaliation, which isn't the worst thing in the world. We're not going to funnel any real interest into that beyond early game though, so it's probably going to wear out its effectiveness pretty early on. On top of the acid and chaos damage buffs though, you're also getting a % increased damage to the undead, so you'll be doing 6% more damage to any undead that you come across with any skill that you do. So that on its own is really good, but Wretch, It's probably one of those devotions that gets passed up a lot because it doesn't do anything particularly flashy until you really start to dig into the stats that it's giving you. It's good, the affinity is good, and pick it up. It just works with the build. It's going to get you what you want. After you pick up Wretch, you're going over to the blue side of things, which are primordial devotions, and we're going to take a look at the Gallows. Gallows, right out of the gate, is going to give you vitality and chaos damage buffs, which are perfect as our 1-2 big guy and backup dancers. Now, the Gallows is another very underrated devotion, I think. But once you get your second point into Gallows, you're getting a 3% maximum health increase along with 10% bleeding resistance. Move on to point number 3, you're getting another 3% health, meaning that just this devotion has given you 6% of your maximum health, and you're getting a 10% vitality resistance on top of everything else. Those 2 points got you 2 different resistances that are very, very important going into Ultimate. So you don't notice them early on when you're playing in normal, but they do mean so much more as they start shredding your resistances in the higher difficulties. The final point of Gallows is actually the best part, in my opinion, because not only is it going to buff your vitality and chaos damage yet again, you're going to get 8 flat base vitality damage to your kit with just this 1 point. Because it adds to the base of your damage, the multipliers that you get from weapons and abilities and whatever you have will be that much better because you're increasing the base to multiply it further. The other stats that this last point is going to come with are going to work really well with Wretch, actually. You're going to get another 6% damage to the undead, meaning that this build is doing 12% extra damage to the undead, and that you should absolutely shred through the Arcovian Undercity and Chapter 2, Act 2. All of these undead people hanging around will get absolutely blasted by all of your damage, and you can thank the Gallows and the Wretch for helping you do just that much more. You're also going to get another 6% damage to humans, so people like bandits probably aren't going to like you a whole lot, but it's good. It's a % increase across the board for those types of enemies and the damage that you can deal to them. That'll be it for the devotions in this video, though. Once we get to the next part, you'll see these fill out a little bit more. We're going to make our way over to the Eye of the Guardian in the next video, and that is where a lot of our incidental acid damage is going to come from. That being said, though, that should do it for this video with all things in tow. Hopefully you had an absolutely doom-filled time, and you're already counting down the doom ticker until the next doomed video. Thank you all for tuning in. I will catch you next time. Peace out.